So if you find this sleep story helpful or interesting, then give it a thumbs up, leave any comments that you've got below, and if you aren't already, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you can receive notifications of when future sleep stories go live. I have dozens and dozens of stories already on my channel that you can go and search. I also release new stories every single week, so I hope you enjoy this story. So as you take a moment to allow your eyes to close and allow yourself to begin to relax, you can listen along to this sleep meditation in the background. And as you listen along, I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster to the sound of my voice or to the spaces between my words. And as you begin to comfortably drift asleep, I'm just going to tell this sleep meditation in the background. And it's about a man who's going out on a trek, and he's trekking through a jungle, heading to the mountains. And as he treks through the jungle, so he is hacking his way through. He can hear the sounds of birds around him, hear the rustling of the leaves of the trees. And he's aware that high up in the canopy there's a light shower falling on those leaves, and he can hear that pitter-patter of the rain and the occasional drop of rain that makes its way through the canopy to the ground below. And as he walks deeper through the jungle, hearing the sound of his footsteps against the ground, he thinks about the journey that he's on, trekking through this jungle to the foot of the mountains, to go in search of treasure in a cave up in the mountains. And he's unsure what he'll find, whether that treasure will still be there. But as an explorer, he's excited to find out. And as the day wears on, so he begins to wear out, and he decides to stop and just take some time to camp for the night. Then he ties a tent between some trees and sets up a tent that hangs between those trees, climbs up a rope ladder into the tent, and in the centre of this tent is a space for a campfire. And so he lights a campfire, and the smoke rises up from that campfire up through a hole in the centre of the tent. And he sits, keeping dry at the side of the tent. And there's a slight sway to the tent as it rests in those trees. He cooks himself some food, can smell that food cooking, can hear the slight crackling of the campfire. And after eating, he puts out that fire, covers that over, and settles down and drifts comfortably asleep. And the next day he awakens feeling so refreshed and invigorated to the sounds of the jungle. He climbs down from the tent, packs that tent away and continues his journey. And after a long while, he can begin to hear the distant flowing of a river, and he heads towards that flowing river, arrives at the river, can smell that water from the spray from the river, can see how fast that river's flowing past through this jungle. and he begins to follow the edge of the river, heading upstream towards the mountains, and he can see the mountains that the river has travelled down before heading into the jungle. And he arrives at the foot of those mountains and begins to ascend. And at first the ascent is difficult, ascending through trees. But then after a while the trees begin to thin out. And then he's just ascending over dry ground. But as he gets higher and higher, so the air cools down. He finds himself climbing through snow. And he continues on, climbing higher and higher. He can see the clouds hanging low over the jungle. He continues to climb higher and higher up. And he can notice what looks like the cave off in the distance, high up in the mountains. And so he pushes on, crunching through the snow, feeling that bracing breeze against his face, feeling the warmth of his body as he climbs that mountain. And after almost a whole day of trekking through the jungle, climbing that mountain, he finally arrives at the cave. And as he enters the cave, so the wind dies down, and you can hear the slight whistling of that wind as it passes the entrance to the cave. And the first thing he does is relaxes down in that cave, puts his backpack down, sets up a campfire near the entrance, lights that campfire, takes some layers off, and relaxes to the warmth of the campfire, and has something to eat. And he gazes out of that cave, over the setting sun, over the clouds below, thinking about how far he's come. And he can hear the crackling fire and see the way that the firelight and shadows dance on the wall. And you can hear the sound echoing deep into the cave and reverberating back out again. And after having something to eat and having rested, he puts out that fire, preparing to set off deeper into the cave. He puts his backpack back on. He turns on a torch hanging on his jacket and begins to walk into the cave. And as he walks into the cave, so he can hear the occasional distant drip of water. And he notices that it's warmer in the cave than it is outside on the edge of the mountain. And the cave walls are rough and damp. But after a while of following this one long cave tunnel, he notices something strange. He notices that there appears to be a doorway that looks almost metallic, but as he touches it with his fingers, he can feel that it's got a slight rubbery feel to it. he can't explain the rubbery feel or why this door is here. But he's curious what's the other side of the door. And he feels around that door, trying to find a way in. And he taps on the door. And he can't work out what's behind the door. But then all of a sudden, as he's tapping on that door with both hands in different places, he taps in such a way that the door seems to open. He doesn't know exactly what it is that he did to make that door open, but the door slides open. And as he walks in, so light flickers on. And he finds himself in what looks like an illuminated steel corridor. And he follows that corridor, walking deeper and deeper into this cave. He can hear his footsteps echoing like footsteps on steel. And then he sees that there appears to be rooms off of this corridor. But he decides to continue on to explore whatever the big room is that looks like it's in front of him. And as he arrives at that big room, so he notices that it looks like there are panels with screens. And as he touches one of them, so they all come to life and suddenly resemble buttons. And he jumps back slightly as everything seems to come to life around him. And then he can see on a monitor that looks like it's a window, the inside of the cave that this thing is in. And he realizes that he's walked onto a spaceship that seems to be embedded within this mountain. He doesn't know how large this spaceship is or how long this spaceship has been here. He imagines it must have been here a long time to somehow be inside the mountain. He sees on that screen, overlaid over the image out of that screen, of the inside of the cave, what looks like dots and larger circles and lines. And over on one of the panels, he can see a green flashing dot. And he walks over to that panel. He presses that green flashing dot. And as he does, so he can feel shaking. And he clings on while the ship shakes. And then he hears a thud and can see daylight in the monitor. And then within seconds of seeing daylight, he can see what looks like the Earth on that monitor. And he realizes that somehow he's launched this ship out of that mountain and into outer space. And on the monitor, he can see what looks like a route mapped out, as if somehow pressing that green button had given permission for this ship to travel to a destination, almost like setting in coordinates into a sat-nav and giving an automatic car permission to follow the route to the destination in the sat-nav. And while the ship flies, following whatever its route is to whatever the destination is. The man is a little uncertain what's going to happen, but decides now's a good time to quickly go and check those other rooms, see if he can learn anything about the experience. And so he goes into the first room, and it looks like sleeping quarters. He goes into another room, and it looks like an area for lounging around and relaxing. In another room, it looks like somewhere people eat. And he can't see any clues as to who the people were. And he can't seem to find any documents. It seems like somehow this spacecraft was abandoned entirely empty, as if it was cleared out when it was abandoned. And he goes back to the main control room. The room he decides to think of as the bridge of the ship. And he's surprised at how fast it seems to be travelling. He can see on the map on the screen that it looks like they're already nearly halfway to their destination. And yet it feels like they've only just left the Earth. And he can't seem to work any of the controls, so all he can do is sit back and wait and see where this ship is going. And after a while, he notices that one of the stars is getting brighter and brighter, closer and closer in the screen. And he can see on the map on the screen, they're getting closer and closer to a star system that's got some planets circling it. And as it gets closer and closer, it eventually starts to go into an orbit around that star before arriving at one of the planets, circling one of the planets, and then slows down and heads down towards that planet. And it seems to be on an autopilot to landing. And as it heads down, so the man notices that there seems to be lots of craft in the sky, craft heading off into space, craft flying around, tall buildings. And this planet looked very Earth-like, but as if it was Earth in the future. And then the craft found an area, settled itself down and landed. And the man didn't know what to expect. He heard the door opening. He heard footsteps walking down the corridor. He could hear talking, and it all sounded familiar, and yet he couldn't understand it. And then after a few moments, tall humanoids walked onto the bridge, and the man was aghast and didn't know what to say. He then introduced himself and said what he was doing, and said that he'd somehow accidentally discovered this ship and accidentally set it off on a course back to this planet. And after just a few moments of him talking, these humanoids began talking back in a way that he could understand. They explained that they can grasp and interpret languages and reply in languages because of a chip embedded in the back of their neck that's connected to their nervous system and connected to a network of deep information and to computers that are incredibly advanced. And they explained this ship had travelled out into the galaxy thousands of years earlier, and that many ships had travelled out into the galaxy thousands of years earlier, and they'd gone to explore planets which looked like they would be able to have life develop. And the idea was that these aliens would monitor that life. And the ship that found its way to Earth had just never returned. And that they were going to send another ship to try to find what had happened to that ship. But then they received a signal saying that there was no need to send another ship. Everything's perfectly fine. But that the aliens on that ship had decided to stay on Earth, had decided to monitor the cultures, monitor the creatures on the planet, and see how they developed over time. They'd explained that they had been noticed by the creatures on the planet. They'd been noticed by the humans. And that the humans had started treating them almost like gods. And so they felt that by staying, they'd be able to demonstrate that they're not gods, that they're mortal beings that live, age, and then die, and that they would be able to monitor these humans, record information about the humans, and that one day in the future, maybe the ship will get collected, and they would set in a return course, so that if at any point it was necessary, that ship could run on autopilot back to where it came from, and that it would contain the information they'd learned. And the man explained that he hadn't found any information. He'd searched the different rooms. He couldn't find any evidence at all of who had been on this ship. And the aliens walked over to one of the consoles. They slid some of the sliders on the touch screens. They pressed a few buttons, and then on the main viewer, documents appeared in a language with symbols that the man couldn't understand. With a couple more presses, those documents translated into English. And the man was able to see all these records about how these aliens had tried to integrate themselves into the culture in the area. And they'd still been treated as if they were like gods. They were treated as being almost like giants because they're a few feet taller than the humans in the area. And they lived longer than the humans in the area, but they did age. And they tried to fit in with society. They tried to demonstrate that they were aging. And they kept their technology hidden. They kept their technological knowledge hidden. And every week they would make the trek up the mountain. They would add more of that information to the records on the ship. Until eventually they stopped travelling up that mountain, and they stopped adding records. And the man was curious to see that there were some videos that were taken from afar. And after seeing these records, the man was curious what had happened. He said that he'd gone hunting in the jungle for treasure, that he'd heard stories about the culture, and stories that the gods there had hidden a treasure in a cave in the mountain. And he assumed that it was going to be perhaps gold or something else precious. He didn't realise that perhaps the locals had been talking about a spaceship buried deep inside the mountain. And the aliens were curious to hear his tale, just as he was curious to tell it, to try and fill in the blanks about how those aliens on Earth had been perceived, how this had become mythology in the area, how the aliens, travelling up to the mountains, to that cave every week, obviously got the interest of the civilization living there. And although they never went up to the mountain while the aliens were around, they were curious watching these aliens every week climb that mountain and go into that cave. And then somehow that civilization must have found its way up to the cave and found a door it couldn't open, and perhaps assumed that there was some treasure there, that it was something so important. And then that civilization died out, and just the myths were left behind. And the man wondered how he was going to get back home. And the aliens said it doesn't take long in our ships, that they will travel in this ship back to Earth, and they'll drop him off and then bring their ship back with them. And they launched that ship. They said that they couldn't allow him to roam around their planet to see any other technology. That one thing they'd learned was that it's not helpful to give someone a huge technological boost, that any species that suddenly gets a huge technological boost well beyond their years struggles to cope with it. It can cause an imbalance of power in societies. And so they generally prefer to just observe and try not to interfere in the natural course of things. That if they think they can save people, they'll potentially save people. But they do what they can, as far as possible, not to interfere, and not to suddenly give people technology well above where they're at. And that from looking at this man, they can see that they're still well away from the type of technology that they're using, but that they've made advances since the days that these aliens had arrived on Earth. And so the aliens launched that spacecraft, left the planet, travelled rapidly back to the Earth, and landed that spacecraft back down in the space left in that mountain, and the very peak of the mountain was missing where the spacecraft had launched out of it. And they let the man out of the craft. He didn't know what he was going to be able to have to show for his experience. They hadn't given him anything. He hadn't got any photos. No one would believe him. And he walked off of that spacecraft. He watched as in almost a blink it disappeared from view from that cave space. And he noticed over in one of the corners, in this cave space which was now open to the sky above, seemed to be a large pile of golden coins and other precious stones and metals and ornaments. And he went over to that. He took a look at those coins. He took a look at the other items that were there. And he saw that it looked like there was a gap. Like maybe people knew something was here. That perhaps the civilization had been climbing the mountain after the aliens had died. And they couldn't get into the alien ship, but had found that there was a hole in the mountain. And so the cave wasn't the right place to head for the treasure. But round the side of the mountain beyond the cave was on the outside of the mountain what looked almost like a small stone shrine with a hole behind it, and that hole led down into the cave below, and that they had been throwing offerings down into that cave, perhaps for hundreds of years, until that civilization had passed. And the man gathered up many different coins, ornaments, precious stones. He took some photos of the shrine. Before heading back down that mountain, following that river, camping another night in that jungle. Before leaving the next day and making his journey home, taking with him this treasure, knowing that he'll probably just write it up as being treasure from offerings to gods, and will probably not say anything about his alien encounter. And once home, he writes up a paper about his experience, about his journey, about the treasures that he found. He prints that off, places it down next to his computer, heads to bed, and drifts and floats comfortably and peacefully asleep.